Hello and welcome to the CS Week WebEd webinar series. This series offers educational webinars that bring to light timely topics which impact utilities in a broad way. I'm Lisa Collins with CS Week, and I'm your host today, along with Jennifer Gilmore with Neustar and Mitchell Young, who will facilitate question and answers at the end of the session. Mark your calendars for CS Week and Conference 41, which will be held May 22nd through 26, 2017 at the Fort Worth Convention Center in Fort Worth, Texas. This program will be recorded and available for playback along with our other archived presentations later this afternoon. You will find it by clicking Webinars from our homepage and then selecting WebEd option from the drop-down menu. Attendees are encouraged to upload questions to the Q&A panel as they arise. However, they will all be held until at the end of the presentation for the Q&A segment. So please ensure that you address your questions to all panelists so that we may all see them. Today's webinar is TCPA and Utilities, FCC Clarifies Requirements for Calls and Texts. And this time, I'll turn it over to our presenters.
Great. Well, thank you, Lisa, and I'd like to extend a thank you to CS Week for hosting this webinar. My name is Mitchell Young. I'm with Neustar. So we're going to talk today about TCPA and utilities and the recent FCC clarification that came out and the response to the ruling by EEI and AGA. First, a little bit of housekeeping in terms of timing and logistics for today, and then I'll introduce both those folks that are going to be speaking and the agenda. In terms of timing, we have an hour set for the agenda for the webinar. I think we'll take about 40 minutes on content, and then we should have plenty of time to go through questions and answers, so please do write in any questions that you might have. In terms of attendees, just to get a sense of this particular topic, there were 277 people who registered today for TCPA. So if you joined us and we see people attending from all across the U.S., you're not alone. There are, I think, everybody across the utilities industry has been paying attention to TCPA this year, learning more about it, and certainly this recent ruling has brought it even more into the forefront. So we know it's a big issue for everybody. I'd like to kind of introduce the speakers today. So, my name is Mitchell Young. I'm the Executive Director of Fraud, Risk, and Compliance at Neustar. I've been at Neustar for a little over 12 years now. I'm joined by my colleague, Becky Burr, who is our Chief Privacy Officer and Deputy General Counsel at Neustar. And Becky has a great background. She worked for some time at the FCC herself, so she's spent time both on the government side and in law firm side and now corporate side. So she's been a great asset for us to have as our Chief Privacy Officer at Neustar. We also have Kristine Devine, who's joined us today. She's a partner at Harris, Wiltshire, and Grannis. Scott Blake Harris and she worked together as leads on the EEI AGA petition. So Scott, who was also going to join us, got pulled away on some other matters with the government, and we're very fortunate to have Kristine with us, and the two of them are, we're the leads on the EEI AGA petition, and as we prepped for today, I think there's a lot of great insight that both Kristine and Becky can provide. So let me walk through our agenda for today. There are four main things that we'd like to cover. So the first is a little bit of background on TCPA, both the current environment and a ruling that happened in 2015 by the FCC, which is one of the things that really brought TCPA into the forefront across many industries. We've certainly been doing a lot of work across the financial industries and the collection industries and others, and I think utilities, it's become more and more of an issue for utilities. So we're going to give you a little bit of background of the recent rulings. And then we're going to spend most of our time talking about the EEI AGA petition, the FCC's response, and go through the details of what the request was and what the FCC's response was. Then we're going to talk about applying TCPA to the utilities industry. Every industry has some unique communication aspects to it, and certainly the utility industry is the same. And there are many critical communication types and notices, both text and calls, that the utility industry provides as a service to its customers. And we want to make sure, as best as we can arm you with knowledge so you can be sure the types of communications that you can keep doing very confidently, and those that are still a little unclear. So we'll walk certainly through specifics around communication types and how it relates to TCPA within the utilities industry. And then we'll talk a little bit about managing your TCPA risk. We'll showcase a risk assessment we've done across the industry, looking at some data as it relates to TCPA within the utility industry. So I think we're going to try to leave you with three things. One is expert legal insight, and certainly Becky and Kristine are going to be able to provide a lot. We've teed up, I think, the key aspects to cover, and then they'll be available in Q&A. I'll provide some solution insight and some phone and industry insight. And then we're hoping to provide a little peer insight if we can get our poll to work, because I think another big thing that I know people in the utility industry are interested in is, where is everybody else? Where is the industry today? What are people doing to both prepare for TCPA? What solutions might be in place? So if we can, we'll also try to provide some peer insight. So in terms of background and TCPA compliance and kind of the current environment, the first question often is, why should I care? Does it really relate to me? And the way that we sum it up, and this is kind of very basic, is any company who calls or texts customers should understand what TCPA is and the potential risks. And the reason it runs across industries and it's so broad is unwanted calls and texts were absolutely the #1 consumer complaint to the FCC over the last several years. So the FCC's response has been, how do we take care of these consumers who are complaining so much about unwanted calls and texts? And in the FCC's response, they have certainly favored consumer protection and consumer privacy, and I think the fallout from that is that corporate America, and we put utilities in that bucket, we're really offered no relief. That there's a lot that companies need to do to ensure that they're reaching the right customers. And on top of that, I think one of the things that's made it a big issue and a challenging issue is that the environment out there is heavily litigious. So these are very high levels around everybody needs to care, and in fact, companies that have customers are challenged in their communication. There's certainly ways to do it with limited risk, and I think we want to help the utilities understand how they can keep communicating with their customers to provide, the critical and important services that they're providing. So in terms of TCPA lawsuits, and I think this is one of the reasons why so many companies are taking this seriously and doing it quickly, is that TCPA lawsuits are certainly on the rise. We've seen this trend continue in 2016, and there's been, I think, 30 to 50% growth in 2016, and the lawsuits in terms of these class action lawsuits are quite large. Damages for unsolicited calls or text, or calls or texts that are sent to the wrong person, can range from $500 to $1,500 per offense. So the consumers are on the offensive, and this is one of the big issues. Fortunately for the utility industry, there have been some, but not too many yet, class action suits and some individual suits. But we think, the utility industry has not felt the pain of TCPA like some of the other industries mentioned here, certainly financial services, collections, and retail, where some of these large class action lawsuits have been brought in the last few years and where we've done a lot of work. So that's the background. We were going to do some poll questions right now. Denise, I don't know if we're able to do the poll questions. I'll wait and see if these polls come up. there were 2 polls that we were going to ask, and really the idea was to get some peer insight. I'll talk through them, and I think I have a hunch of what the answers are going to be, so I'll share them as part of our peer insight. So the first question.
I was able to get them to work, so they're live now, but you can still talk through them as people are answering.
Great. So the first question is, do you currently have a TCPA solution in place? It's a very simple yes-no answer. We thought it would be interesting for everybody that's participating today to get a sense of where their peers lie in terms of, do you have a solution yet in place? So it's a quick, easy question. We'll give maybe 10 or 15 seconds for people to answer, and then we'll share the results. All right. Thank you all. Denise, can you pull up, show the results? Give us a sec as it populates. All right. I see. Oh, great. So both questions came up. Okay. So we see that 21% of respondents actually have a solution in place. 40% have no solution in place, and there is about 40% that didn't answer. So I think the trend that we've been seeing in the utility industry is that it's still early. Certainly in the financial industries, in the collection industries and retails, I think we'd see 60 to 70% have solutions in place today. So I think it's still early days in the utility industry. So if you're feeling like I'm not quite sure what TCPA is yet and I'm still educating myself, I think you're not alone. In the second question, where are you in the process of evaluating TCPA? 37% are still in the educating myself and my organization on TCPA solutions. So if that's where you are in the majority. There's some that are, a small percent that are actually currently evaluating or testing different solutions, and 14% that are implementing or planning an implementation. So there's a few that are starting to get solutions in place, but still many. So if it's some comfort of where your peers are, still educating yourselves on TCPA and figuring out a potential solution for your organization. So let's move on now, and we'll spend some time with Becky Burr and Kristine Devine talking through some of the legal aspects of TCPA. So Becky, I'll ask you first. In 2015, the FCC issued its declaratory ruling, which brought up some key clarifications around TCPA that has driven a lot of the activity around TCPA. So why a declaratory ruling? And can you walk us through some of those key points?
That spike in class action activity had really commenced prior to 2015, and partly in response to that, dozens of businesses and trade associations filed various petitions with the FCC asking for clarifications. And so the FCC bundled these all up into one very big declaratory ruling in which they ruled on a bunch of them, not the utilities questions, as we'll talk about. But and people were really hoping that the declaratory ruling was going to put to rest some of the issues that were being pretty hotly contested in the class action litigation. One question that people had was, if I get consent from a consumer to call them, to auto-dial them on their wireless number, and then I continue to dial that, or to auto-dial that number in good faith, and all of a sudden, I've suddenly reached somebody else because the consumer who consented has turned in their phone number. Well, I'm still, it's still my intention to call the party that gave consent. Why should that constitute a violation of TCPA? And the FCC basically said it doesn't matter who you intend to call. It requires the consent of the current subscriber to the number, or the current sort of constant user. So for family plans and the like, you might have, somebody officially a subscriber with somebody else being the typical user of that phone. And so, the answer was if you dial a wrong number or a reassigned phone number, yes, there is a potential exposure under TCPA. The FCC also went to great lengths to make sure that people understood that the notion of consent means inherently that a consumer has a right to revoke their consent at any time, and they went further to say you can't make consumers jump through hoops in order to revoke their consent. You have to be able to accept and process their consent through any means where you actually communicate with them. So, if you have a retail facility, you've got to have somebody at the store who is able to accept and process those revocations. The other issue that would face a lot of people in the many class action suits ended up dealing with is what's the definition of an auto dialer? Sure, the system could be programmed to auto dial numbers sequentially or randomly, but I'm not using it that way. I am, in fact, have an operator actually take some kind of action to initiate a phone call in every instance. Is that an auto? That's not an auto dialer if I'm not using it as an auto dialer. And the Commission came back and said, sorry, the language of the statute is if it has the capacity to store, produce, and dial random or sequential numbers, even if you're not using it for that purpose, it is an auto dialer. And people said, well, gee, that means, your speed dial on your smartphone is an auto dialer. And the Commission really declined to provide much clarity here. They said, essentially, we think there are some outer bounds, like it's probably highly unlikely that your rotary dial telephone could be considered an auto dialer. And people aren't complaining about speed dial on smartphones, so we don't think that's a problem yet. But basically, we're going to continue to evaluate this on a case-by-case basis, which of course means that courts are going to continue to evaluate whether something meets the not particularly clear definition of an auto dialer. And the Commission did provide some limited exceptions for time-sensitive financial and healthcare calls, but beyond that, it really did not provide a lot of assistance to industry that was is and continues to be in the sort of focal point of these class action litigations.
Great. Thanks, Becky. So as we move into the next slide, Kristine, I think the FCC declaratory ruling kind of dovetailed in timing somewhat to the EEI AGA petition, but they may have been a bit separate. So you worked on this petition. Tell us about the intention and kind of what the focus of the petition was and the outcomes.
Sure. So you're right. There was a little bit of overlap in timing. Obviously, we had been watching the docket at the FCC, and we knew that there were, a number of pending petitions related to TCPA-related claims, and we knew the FCC would eventually get around to addressing them. And, EEI and AGA really wanted to avoid, as much as possible, getting lumped in with everyone else because, utility service is different. And that really was the focus of our request to the FCC, that calls to utility customers about their service, particularly about service outages or the potential for service outages, those aren't really, they shouldn't be lumped in with any number of other kinds of information calls because they're different, they're critical. People rely on electricity. So we filed the petition, I don't want to say preemptively, but sort of in order to get the FCC to pay attention to the utility questions separately from all of these other petitions from other companies and trade associations. And by and large, that worked. As the 2015 order approached and we knew it was happening, we repeatedly got assurances from the Commission that EEI and AGA were going to be treated separately, that they understood the importance of our petition and of our request. And what we were really asking for was to let EEI and AGA and its members, the investor-owned utilities and gas companies, electric utilities and gas companies across the country, to know that they could make calls to customers without needing to get any additional consent other than that the customer had given them the phone number for calls related to the utility service. And we specifically asked the FCC to grant this sort of declaratory ruling about this level of consent for 7 categories of calls, and those are listed here. And it's basically unplanned or planned outages, so there's going to be service work on your street, we're going to have to take your service out for 3 hours, that kind of thing. Or, a transformer has blown in your area, you're going to be without service. Service outages, updates, and restoration, we believe service should be restored in 8 hours. Or your service is restored, so maybe you're not home and you want to go home and now your service is back on. Asking questions, can you let us know, is your electric service back on? Great. Meter work, tree trimming, field work, when you might have an electric company representative out at your property, both for your safety and the safety of those workers, we're going to let you know we're going to be out reading your meter or we're going to be out trimming your trees. A really important one to EEI and AGA that we worked really hard to get the FCC to understand was confirmation, or rather pre-termination notices of a payment problem that might result in service shutoff. And realistically, this is the kind of thing that many state public service commissions require utilities to do anyway. And so, EEI and AGA found that their members were really getting squeezed. They weren't allowed to make these calls to their customers under the TCPA without getting, sort of more robust consent, or they were afraid of the litigation risk, but they still had to reach out and say, hey, you're, 60 days, 90 days past due, we're going to have to shut off your service. So we asked for that as well, but we clarified that we weren't talking about post-termination debt collection because that tends to be a really touchy point for the consumer advocates. Another one that we felt strongly about was eligibility for subsidies or payment plans because of age or income or disability. Those are very important programs that utilities administer and that public service commissions require us to sort of make, sort of proactive efforts with. And not being able to inform customers that, hey, you're having trouble paying your bill, you may be eligible for a subsidy, was really creating problems. And then finally, brownouts. That's, I think, similar to the service outages. So we asked for this. It wasn't really even an exception. It was just asking the FCC to clarify that when a customer gives the utility its phone number, by giving that number, that is the equivalent of prior express consent, not written consent, prior express consent, for these 7 categories of informational calls, so that when we make those calls to customers who've given us their phone number, we don't run into that risk getting sued. You know, and as Mitchell pointed out, the litigation risk is obviously quite substantial, and there have been utilities that have faced lawsuits. And it's, you know, your utilities, right? You have a limited ability to absorb litigation costs because you have your concern for the rate base. So making sure that you could do these really critical calls that aren't emergency calls necessarily, but that are very, very important without facing the risk of litigation was really very, very important to EEI and AGA. And it was very important that the Commission treat this request separately. So we worked really hard to make sure that these things were separated out from, you know, sort of the lump of other petitions that were addressed in the 2015 order, and we did that successfully, I'm pleased to say.
Well, thank you, Kristine. The detail is great in terms of seeing these 7 categories, and we've certainly talked to many utilities throughout the year who've all said, well, we're just, you know, we're not making any calls right now until we see what the FCC says. And, you know, when you look at the types of informational notices and critical communication this represents, it's so unfortunate that things have to be held up because of, you know, the unknowns around TCPA. So I think this clarification is so helpful, and I hope for many they can begin their texting and calling again around these. And we will, in another slide or two, revisit this topic around consent and look at both emergency calls and marketing calls to make sure there's clarity around, you know, types of communication and consent required. I think the one thing that still emerges, and we see these across all the other industries that we've worked with, is that the real challenge that TCPA has posed, or the challenge for companies to tackle, is these reassigned phone numbers. And Kristine, from your perspective, we know it's relevant in all the other industries. What's your view on kind of reassigned phone numbers as it relates to the utilities? Same type of risk, or what else do you see? Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, you know, there is a risk here, and it's funny. You know, we didn't ask the FCC to give us any special treatment on reassigned numbers because this has been such a hot point in TCPA advocacy. But it is a problem for utilities because customers, you know, they give you their phone number when they sign up for service, and then they may not come back and update it later. You know, they may change cell phone numbers and forget, or they port a number from their home phone to their wireless, and so you don't know that it's a wireless number. You know, this kind of thing happens all the time, and it is a risk for utilities because even under the order that we got from the FCC, that really just covers consent. It doesn't get you out of the other bucket of risk. You know, you still have to make sure you're calling the right person and calling the right number. And, you know, also, I should say in there, if the customer asks you not to call them, you also have to honor that. That's the opt-out. So, you know, the big risk is in the consent piece, right? Like, you don't want to be making what are perfectly legitimate calls and getting sued for that. But you still have to make sure you're calling the right person. And just as in any industry, utilities, you know, they can't always know that they've got the right number because people do change their numbers so often. And particularly in utilities, again, you know, someone gives you their number when they sign up for service or when they move to a new address, but they may not update it 2 years later when they, you know, change their phone number or when they, you know, switch service, and suddenly you've got a number that's several years out of date.
Thanks. And you know, Becky, I know you spent time at the FCC or, you know, as the FCC was exploring their declaratory ruling and talking to kind of the industry and different experts. Anything that you want to share? I mean, I think you were involved in some conversations prior to their ruling. Thoughts, insight on this particular challenge or how the FCC viewed it?
Yeah, so, you know, we started noticing that you know, claims were coming up that, you know, it was easy for industry to understand when a phone number had been changed, and like claims in some of the class action litigation. So we reached out to the FCC when they were still in their sort of exploratory phases of this to make sure that they understood that there was in fact no silver bullet out there, that while there are some things you can do to reduce the risk that you're calling a number that's been transferred to somebody else. It really is very difficult, impossible, frankly, to know with 100% certainty that the person who gave you consent is still the subscriber to that telephone number. So we went in and we talked to them about this, and they did in the report acknowledge the message about there being no silver bullet for this. But really where they came down on the issue was simply just a sort of, we're going to make a call and you know, draw a line. And so, you know, they ended up saying, well, we'll give you one call to a number that has been transferred to another subscriber. But after you make that one call, whether you actually learn that the number has been reassigned or not, in fact, whether or not anybody answers the telephone that you dial, we're going to say you have you know, awareness that the number has been reassigned. It's clearly a fiction in terms of actual awareness of any such reassignment, but they basically said, you know, we have to choose between sort of consumer interests in not having unwanted telephone calls and you know, the legitimate problem that businesses face, and we're coming down on the side of the consumer privacy interests here. So you know, the order doesn't you know, makes quite clear that they know there's no silver bullet, but says, but you know, there are some things that you can do. Some of them are kind of silly, like you can ask consumers to, or you can require consumers in your contract with them to notify you when they change their telephone numbers. But of course, if they fail to do that, you're still on the hook for this. But then there are some other things that you can do to mitigate risk. But in the end, we're going to put the exposure and the risk here on businesses, not on consumers.
Great, thank you, thank you. So we'll turn now, and we started to a little bit with the petition talk about how we apply, you know, applying TCPA to utilities. And this is a table that I think should be helpful in terms of looking at least in kind of general buckets, types of notifications that utilities industries is utilizing. And there's three general buckets: emergency notifications, kind of general or informational notifications, and telemarketing or marketing messages. And what we wanted to look at are some examples in the consent required, so everyone is clear, given the recent ruling, what consent you need for what types of notifications. So, you know, maybe we'll start in the middle bucket under general notifications, because I think this is one of the most important areas. Kristine, and this is the area we were just talking about in terms of the 7 types of notifications that, or communications that the FCC responded to. But can you talk a little bit about this again and just make sure, let's cover this one more time?
Yep, absolutely. So, you know, the TCPA says, or the rules say, that you only need what's called prior express consent to make informational calls, and that's an area of confusion. And our petition asks the Commission to expressly say that for utilities, calls in those 7 categories, when they are made to the number that the customer gave you, that you have that prior express consent. Basically, that the giving of the phone number is equal to prior express consent. So now you know that for consent, you meet the consent requirement when you call a customer at the number the customer gave you, and the call falls into one of those 7 categories. So you don't have to worry about consent in that situation. You're calling the customer's number, the number they gave you, and the call is related to one of those 7 categories, you're good on consent. Other issues may yet arise. You have other risk, right? And we've just talked about the reassigned numbers risk. But for consent, that gets you out of the consent problem, which is huge for the litigation risk, really.
So maybe we take it to marketing, while we're talking about consent, because for marketing, you need a different type of consent. Maybe you can talk about, what constitutes marketing and kind of what is express written consent.
Yeah, so telemarketing calls, and those are calls that are made to try to convince someone to buy a product or rent something or lease something or spend some money with you. Those calls are subject to a higher level of consent, and this is something that the FCC did in, I think, 2012. They established a whole regime around prior express written consent. And to get prior express written consent, you have to get the customer to consent in writing, which sounds obvious, right, before you make the call. But that consent has to meet a lot of different requirements. It's got to, the consent has to say, I understand that I am consenting for you to call me using an auto dialer or a robotic voice at this number, and that no purchase is necessary, and that, I can revoke my consent at any time. There are a number of parameters that you have to meet. And if you have all of those things, then you may make telemarketing calls to that person at that number. There's no established business relationship exception for wireless numbers, so you have to be careful about that. And the established business relationship exception for landline numbers has been narrowed. So you really have to make sure that you're calling people to sell them something or to try to get them to sign up for some other service or new service. You really have to have that prior express written consent. You've got to keep records. You've got to be able to match your list up with the do not call list, the federal do not call list. There are a bunch of different things you have to do, and of course opt-out still applies for telemarketing calls as well. So the consent obligation on that telemarketing row it's robust. And be wary with what constitutes telemarketing, because it's not just please buy a service. When we were talking to the FCC about the petition, there was some skepticism about, we had wanted initially or had proposed initially including calls about demand response pricing. So, hey, tomorrow is going to be a high usage day, reduce your usage during the day and drop your electricity bill. And the FCC said, we're not really sure that falls into the informational category. That kind of feels more like telemarketing. So we dropped it. We backed away. But you need to be careful about what you're doing in that bucket that's telemarketing to make sure that, if it looks a little bit like telemarketing, if it looks like you're trying to sell something or get someone to sign up for a service, or, money is going to change hands, be really careful about making sure you have the right kind of consent.
Great, and then let's talk about emergency notifications, because true emergency notifications would be exempt. So can you talk about what does exempt mean and what may be an emergency notification?
Sure, and this is a really relevant question to the petition, because a number of people said to us during that process, a lot of these calls that you're mentioning, these seem like emergency calls. And maybe they are, hey, a transformer blew in your neighborhood, or hey, there's a gas leak in your area. Those seem like they could be emergencies, but maybe not. Is it really an emergency if a transformer blew in your neighborhood? I don't know. Gas leak, that's probably an emergency. The scope, though, of what constitutes an emergency is not terribly clear. I think there are some people that would say, well, if it looks like an emergency, it's an emergency. You know it when you see it. The problem is, emergency calls are completely exempt from the TCPA. There's no restriction on auto dialers. There's no need for consent. There's no problem with reassigned numbers. If it's an emergency call, you just make it. But then if it's not really an emergency, then you find yourself litigating down the road whether it was or wasn't an emergency, which is why we asked for all of these sort of service-related exceptions or clarifications for consent, so that utilities could make those important calls without worrying about down the road having to litigate on a case-by-case basis whether a gas leak is really an emergency. But if it is an emergency, and certainly I think there are situations that everyone could agree is an emergency, you don't need consent. You don't need to worry about reassigned numbers. You don't need to worry about opt-out. You can call basically any number you have and let them know there is something really bad going on. Be careful, be careful, be careful. So that's sort of the, the golden ticket up there at the top. If you fall into that row and you're really sure it's an emergency, then make the call. If you're not sure it's an emergency, see if it falls into the 7 categories, because a lot of situations that kind of look like emergencies but maybe aren't probably do fall into those 7 categories. And then you just make sure that you're calling someone who's given you their number, who hasn't opted out, and whose number hasn't been reassigned.
Great. Thank you so much for walking through that. It still sounds like some murky waters around emergency and telemarketing, but great clarity in that kind of core bucket of communication. So I'll spend a few minutes and then we'll turn it over to questions, because I'll walk through kind of a reassigned phone analysis. We will work with companies across many industries, and we have some sample data from a utility industry, from a utility customer data to look at, are there really a lot of reassigned phone numbers? Like how many might I have, and what is the potential risk? So hang in there for a few minutes. We'll walk through an actual analysis that was likely similar for everybody, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. So as a little bit of background, Neustar has been around for, a couple decades, and we partner with the telco industry to help them manage identity in a few areas. We power the majority of caller ID today, so the ability to link names and phone numbers together, over 250 telcos outsource that to us, so we do a tremendous amount of work with them helping to manage caller ID. On a daily basis, we put out all the directory assistance information for when phones are connected and disconnected. We manage daily port data as things are porting from landline to wireless or from carrier to carrier. We do a lot of market share work with the telcos. So in a number of ways, we help the telcos manage identity, which is one of the reasons we've been kind of knit up in this TCPA work. A lot of what we've done prior to TCPA was using this data in the telco industry and for just consumer verification. So for a lot of banks, if you're enrolling into accounts or you log on to a lot of, large tech and internet companies and you're opening accounts or opening, payment transfer accounts or whatnot, we sit there and do a lot of name, address, phone verification. So we have a lot of the data to ensure when phones are ported and changed or reassigned, disconnected, and who they belong to. As I mentioned, we've worked across a lot of industries that relate to TCPA, and I think utilities is slightly just kind of realizing that, hey, this actually matters for us too. So we started to work with a couple of utilities, and I think are in early stages of kind of testing and education. In terms of a risk assessment and reassigned phone numbers, we do these samples a lot and then put programs into place. And it's actually very simple, right, in terms of input data that we might get. So very simply, we might get a customer's name and their phone number, address information, and the date that you've received that phone number, which is, as you now learn from the FCC, the date that consumer has provided consent to you, because prior express consent comes when a customer gives you their phone number. So with those few pieces of information, we take those in and we really use our own data that we have as kind of the current truth table, which is a look at current data. And we'll come back with a verification code to say, hey, based on the data we have, can we verify that this Bill Smith still belongs to that phone number? We look at the phone type of whether or not a phone is a wireless phone or a landline phone. If it's still active, if it's a voice over IP phone, and if the phone has been discontinued or disconnected since consent. The reason we do this, as Becky mentioned, is there is no silver bullet. Even though we have a lot of great current accurate data, it's always hard to have 100% accuracy. So we help companies solve their TCPA risk with a few different data points. First, current verification. the second is a phone still active or not? And the third, has there been any disconnect since consent? And we work to develop business rules that help companies decide, okay, is this phone still okay to call or not? What we often see, and this is pretty common, this was a sample that we looked at where we took in name, address, and phone, 32,000 customer records. And this tends to be the split that we see. Believe it or not, the majority of phones that you probably have linked to your customers are wireless phones. In this particular instance, it was 70% wireless phones and 30% landlines. And this is not an uncommon distribution of phones. Then the critical question is, okay, do the wireless phones that I have still belong to the consumer that gave it to me? So we take in a phone and we come back with a verification code, and there's a few different codes. A 10 is basically, yes, that name and phone we can say is, they still belong together. So, those are the best phones. On the bottom end, these 1s and 2s are whether we can say, hey, you know what, that phone doesn't belong to that customer anymore. It belongs to a different customer. Or that phone service has been discontinued or disconnected since the date that you've received consent. And then there's a few data points in the middle around maybe no data available or we're not quite sure. And what you can see is when you look at wireless and landline phones, they tend to be really similar. At the bottom here, these tend to be where the risks lie, right? And what we know with utilities is that often people are clients for quite a long time. You may have customers for, 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And the likelihood that phones get disconnected and ported and clients don't call you and say, hey, by the way, I changed my phone number, this is where this 20% comes from. Now, there's no silver bullet. Sometimes we just kind of don't have that particular data. Things fall in the middle. But this is where the potential risk exposure is. Now, you may not be calling and texting everybody, but for the phones that you do need to call and text, if you have consent and you're doing the right thing and making informational calls, these are the ones that we say, hey, these pose risk. And then there's certain strategies to put in place around how do I make sure that I update the information with particular customers where you may think that this, you no longer have good information or those phones may be reassigned. And there's lots of different programs and strategies and ways that you can leverage this information to ensure that you are both maintaining, managing, collecting, and updating information so you can mitigate, as much TCPA risk as possible and continue communicating with customers as you need to. So we've seen pretty similar results across the utilities that we're working with and testing with, and I wanted to share this as just a little snapshot so people could understand, okay, well, I understand the reassigned phones pose my risk, but what does it really mean? Like, what are some of those numbers and how do I begin to quantify that? So, a couple delivery options. Most companies send us batch queries where they'll run files every month or every day, depending on how calls are happening. For some companies, we may host a pool of phone numbers and just send out notices when things get disconnected. So there's several different ways to actually put processes in place to help you manage and maintain data, because it's a process that, one, requires a cleanup of data, and then two, requires some kind of ongoing program to manage and maintain data. Because what we see is that phones can get, once a phone gets disconnected, it can get reassigned to someone else in as little as 30 days. So if you verify data today, in 60, 90, 120 days, it could be disconnected and reassigned. So there is a point of cleansing and maintaining data today, and then figuring out some cadence of ongoing management to ensure that your phones still belong to the consumers you believe they belong to. So that's our summary. I think the key takeaways are that TCPA applies to utilities, and everybody should care. It's now an issue that I think once you start understanding it and seeing the potential risks and looking across other industries, it's something that, given all your communication, you should care about it. I think the most important takeaway is if a customer provides you a wireless phone, you have prior express consent to auto dial and text. So for sure, for those that have been holding up communication, you can kind of rest assured that you have the consent that you need. We actually think utilities are in a good position. You know, you have the ability with for all the communication types we talked about to know that as long as you've got the right customer, you have consent, you are good to go. We think that unlike other industries, utilities are actually in a good position now to start cleansing and managing their data and really limiting their TCPA risk. And we know that accurate phone data, you know, it actually goes beyond TCPA risk. There's a lot of great applications and use cases that bring efficiency to a business when they have better communication. So thank you very much for staying with us through this presentation. I really want to thank Becky and Kristine for joining us. Their legal insight and expertise is, you know, key for everybody to really clarify some confusing terms around consent and the types of notifications that are covered and not covered. And thank you very much to CS Week for hosting this. We know it was a hot topic, and a lot of people have really stayed through with us. So I'll turn it over now. We have, you know, almost 10 minutes to go through some Q&A while we still have Becky and Kristine with us. Jennifer, I don't know, I know you've been looking at the Q&A. Would you like me to pull up some questions? Are there some that you think are best to ask?
Yes, Mitch. I can take them if you don't mind. I have them
Great.
Right here on my screen. So the first question is, what is the definition of consent? If the cell phone was provided originally with no indication it is a cell, does that indicate implied consent?
So this is Becky. You know, the problem is it turns on what you're doing, whether you're making an informational call, a purely informational call, a purely marketing call, or something in between. I think the FCC is quite clear that if a consumer provides you with a cell number, whether or not they indicate that it's a cell number in the process of signing up for a service, for example, then you can use that number to auto dial them with transactional or informational messages. So you can infer that. Now, of course, you always have to look at the context, because if you said, you know, give us your phone number so we can notify you if you win $1 million, and then you notify them of other things, that won't work. There's another situation where you know, people gave companies, food delivery companies, their cell phone numbers and then received marketing messages on them. So you can infer depending on the context. But if it is marketing, if your message is marketing, then you have to have that written consent, and it has to be informed in the sense that you do need to tell them that they are giving you permission to use automatic dialing technology to communicate with them about marketing, and informing them that that's not a condition of the purchase.
And the one thing that I would add is the phone type that a customer provides you is really not only irrelevant, but oftentimes erroneous. So we have people that may collect, give me a landline phone, give me a cell phone, and people will put cell phone in the landline or landline in the cell. So you should verify the phone type that you have, regardless of what a consumer may have told you. And sometimes phones port from, you know, landline to wireless. It's not that common, but it does. So you should also confirm the phone type that you have so you can determine the right strategy.
Okay, thank you, Mitch and Becky. The next question we have here is, does the EEI AGA petition also apply to the national energy marketers within the same 7 categories?
And this is Kristine. I think that depends on whether you are a service provider. The EEI petition and the order that came out of it is really as Becky alluded to in her last answer, the consent comes out of the fact that they gave you the phone number in relation to getting service. So you have their phone number as their service provider, so you're allowed to call them on that number for issues related to that service that aren't marketing or telemarketing. If national energy marketers are providing service, utility service to the customer, then they should be covered. If you're just offering information about, rate regulation or other options for other providers, then you're in that gray area, and I think that the petition would not apply.
Okay, thank you. The next question we have is, if a customer has set up an account prior to TCPA, is that considered express consent? If not, what should a utility do to get consent from a long-term customer?
Oh yeah, no, this is Kristine again. This was definitely the point of the petition. No going back to get new consent. If the utility has a number now, then the FCC has agreed that the provision of that number to the utility is consent for the purpose of receiving calls about the utility service. So you don't have to go back and get new consent. The numbers you have, you're good.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, the petition was from electrical and gas utilities. Does this also apply to water utilities? Are there any differences whether it is a private or government utility?
No difference on private or government, and I believe that it should cover water utilities. There was no water utility association that was affiliated, but the order was not limited in that way. It was the provision of utility service.
Okay, thank you. We had a few questions about surveys. Were surveys discussed in the ruling?
I'm not sure I understand the context of the question.
I think the question is a survey a marketing communication or an informational communication?
Oh, yeah. So it almost doesn't matter, because if the survey is not providing information in one of those 7 categories, the petition isn't going to apply to it. I think that's really kind of the way to think about it. When you start getting into, is this survey informational but outside of those 7 categories, then you're going to have to look at it really carefully and determine, sort of what the purpose is. There's higher risk there with respect to litigation. So, be wary in that situation.
Yeah, there's, there is some Federal Trade Commission learning in a different context, in a CAN-SPAM context, about whether a survey is a commercial email or not, and it's pretty context specific, and I would say generally involves a fair amount of risk.
Okay, thank you. I think we have time for one more question. For something like a service outage, how do we prove that the customer provided the phone number? Does that have to be recorded?
Yeah, I know that this was an issue when we were going through this process, because a lot of phone numbers, you may get them by telephone when the customer signs up for service. Look, if you don't have records to prove that you got the number from the customer, that is going to be an issue. To the extent you can keep those records, keep them. There is a level of risk there when you have customers that gave you a number orally over the phone and you don't have written records about it. So you want to maintain whatever records you can that would substantiate a claim that the customer gave you that number.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. That is all the time we have for today. We'd like to thank everybody for attending the webinar, and any questions that were not addressed in the Q&A session, we will respond. Thank you again, everybody, for attending the webinar today.